everything's already said. It's everybody in Sunday school. All right, we'll get started, word of prayer, and then we'll get on in to our lesson, Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter number 15. Alan Bennett, will you open us up in prayer, sir?
Father, Lord, is once again God, that Lord, so want to thank and praise you for another truth.
Yes, Lord, we thank you for this day.
Set aside, Lord, to come to your house.
God, let me in the house of God in this morning.
Lord, I pray, Lord, you
Worship you.
teacher. God, did you use your honor today? Lord, give me an open mind.
Father,
Here to
seek
hear
us such to worship
what the
you.
word's got to say today.
That's
Lord,
the
we
word of God.
love you. We just come to worship you today. Have your way, bless each and every one. Bless each heart, mind, and soul.
God,
So most of all, Lord, if there's one here today that's flawed,
this
Lord,
morning.
without a hope, some will be said or done, Lord, that they see to meet you before it's too late. Lord, we just need to see you today.
Jesus.
And I'll praise you and I'll thank you
Oh,
for what you do.
that's a lot.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Brother Allen. Okay, Mark chapter 15, verse 1. That's where we'll get started here in just a minute. Mark chapter number 15, verse number 1. Just to briefly recap a few things we talked about last week as we finished up chapter number 14. And remember, we were continuing to look at some different responses by different groups of people as Jesus was preparing for his crucifixion. And then we were looking at how in the garden Jesus was forsaken last week. Chapter 14, verse 39, 40, and 41. Remember, Jesus, he goes to pray the second and third time, and he comes back and finds the chosen three, Peter, James, and John, sleeping again. Did that 3 times, and every time he came back and he found them sleeping. Verse 42, this last time he says, he didn't rebuke them or anything. He said, it's time. He says, my betrayal is at hand. Verse 43, of course, we saw where Judas brought a great multitude to try to take Jesus. Said they came with swords and with staves. Judas might have thought that Jesus was going to put up a fight, but we know he didn't. Verse 44, 45, and 46, we talked about where Judas actually kissed the door of heaven. You know, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the door. No man cometh unto me. And so Judas actually kissed the door of heaven. We see Jesus went with him willingly. Verse 47. Peter, of course, cut off Malchus' ear. Mark does not record that, but if we'll read the John's account, we know that was Peter that actually is the one that cut off the servant's ear. Malchus was his name. Verse 48 and 49, Jesus told him, he said, look, you know, you could have already taken me at any time. I was in the temple all the time teaching and preaching, and you could have got me then, but that the scripture might be fulfilled. You waited till this particular point in time. And of course, verses 50, 51, and 52, all the disciples forsook Jesus. Even Peter, who said he would never, all the disciples said the same thing. And even this young man here that may have been, some theologians think it was Mark, in verses 51 and 52, but whatever the case, all the disciples forsook Jesus there in the garden, and they all fled. Then we started looking how in the high priest office, of course that's where Jesus was taken next, he was rejected. Jesus was rejected there. Verse 53, of course he was taken to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, and this was just a mock Jewish trial that was about to take place here. Verse 54, of course, very familiar verse where it talks about how Peter followed afar off, trying to see the things that were going on. But remember, he shouldn't have been following at all, based on the prophecy in Zechariah chapter 13. In verses 55 through 59, no 2 witnesses could get their story straight. Remember, it took at least 2 witnesses if somebody was going to be found worthy of death, and their stories they could not agree on the exact same things they were trying to say, to accuse Jesus of. Of course, they were false accusations, the things they were trying to say. Verse 60 and 61, of course, Jesus said nothing during this time of these false accusations. He didn't say a word. Again, that's just fulfillment of prophecy in Isaiah chapter 53. And then verse 61, Caiaphas actually asking point blank, says, "Are you the Son of the Blessed? Are you the Son of God?" Jesus' response, verse 62, he said, "Yes, I am the Son of God. And one day you're going to know it." So you're going to see me sitting on the throne. You're going to see me coming back in the clouds. Verse 63 and 64, of course, because of this, the Jewish leaders accused him of blasphemy. Anybody that claimed to be God, that was blasphemy to the Jews. So they condemned him to die right there on the spot. Verse 65 talked a little bit about how the physical abuse began with Jesus. He possibly was blindfolded at this time because they said they covered his face. And remember, they spit on him and they hit him with their fist and they slapped him with the palms of their hands. So the physical abuse here started with Jesus. Verse 66 through 68, we see Peter's first denial with the maid there, one of the high priest's maids. He denied knowing Jesus. Then the first time that the cock crew. Then verse 69 and 70, we saw his second denial again with the maid. Once again, he says, "I don't know this man. You're talking about Jesus Christ." And then verses 70 and 71, we see his third denial. And it was such a denial, remember, that he cursed. Not foul language like we know today, but he vowed a vow and he made an oath to the people there. "I don't know this man. I don't know Jesus whom you're talking about." And then verse 72, of course, that's when the cock crew the second time. And that's not what convicted Peter. We talked about that. It was the words of Jesus. He remembered the words that Jesus had said. And the Word of God is what convicted people. Same today. That's what convicts us today. The Word of God is what convicts us today as well. And we finished up last week talking about how we need to be careful not to criticize Peter too much, because we do the same things that he did. We're guilty of the same things that he was. A lot of times we talk when we should listen. We argue when we should obey. We sleep when we should pray like they did. And a lot of times we fight when we actually should submit. So that gets us down here to chapter 15, verse number 1. And again, just to recap real quickly, these things we're talking about from these various groups of people. Remember, Jesus was preparing for his crucifixion. And remember, we talked about in Bethany, he was adored by Mary, of course. In the upper room, of course, we know he was betrayed, or the betrayal started by Judas. And in the garden, he was forsaken by all of the disciples. And then, of course, in the high priest's palace, he was rejected primarily there by the apostle Peter. So again, that gets us to the next one. And then in chapter 15, verses 1 through 20, we're going to see he's going to be in Pilate's hall. Now, that's where he's taken now. In Pilate's hall, we're going to see that Jesus is actually condemned. So let's pick up there in chapter 15, verse 1, and I'll read verses 1 through 20, and we'll come back and look at some of these verses individually. It says, "And straightway," again, there's Mark's word. Again, he likes that word, straightway, immediately. "In the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, 'Art thou the king of the Jews?' And he answering said unto him, 'Thou sayest it.' And the chief priest accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, 'Answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against thee.' But Jesus answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Now at the feast he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them that had made an insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection." And that insurrection, that's just a riot. There was a riot going on. And in this riot, Barabbas here, he killed somebody. Verse 8, "And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. But Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the king of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priests moved the people that they should rather release Barabbas unto them. And Pilate answered and said again unto them, What will ye then that I should do unto him, whom ye call the king of the Jews? And they cried out again, Crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, Why, what evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, Crucify him. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them and delivered Jesus, when he had scourged him, to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium. And they called together the whole band, and they clothed him with purple, and platted a crown of thorns, and put it on his head, put it about his head, and began to salute him, Hail, King of the Jews. And they smote him on the head with a reed, and did spit upon him, and bowing their knees worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe from him, and put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. So we see here these verses that Jesus is taken to Pilate's hall. And again, verse number 1, as we mentioned last week, after this, they had this late night mock Jewish trial. And so then they bring Pilate the following morning for a Roman trial. There's two different trials. They had the Jewish trial that the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the scribes, the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, they had this mock trial at night, and then they took him the next day so they could have a Roman trial. And they had to convince the Roman government, our Governor Pilate, they had to convince him that Jesus was guilty of some type of crime that was worthy of death. So we see in verses 2 through 4, the only possible crime that they were able actually to present to Pilate, to the Roman government, was that Jesus claimed to be a king. And of course, if he claimed to be a king, then this might undermine the authority of Rome. Because verse 2, first part of verse number 2, Pilate asked him, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And so that's the accusation here that they brought, that he said that he was king. Well, notice Jesus' response in verse number 5. But Jesus yet answered nothing, so Pilate marveled. So again, during this time, remember, during the false accusations before the Jewish trial, Jesus didn't say anything until Caiaphas point blank asked him if he was the Son of God, and he said, "Yes, I am." Well, the same thing here. During this Roman trial here before Pilate, Jesus, he didn't say anything either. And again, that goes back to the scriptures we talked about last week. Isaiah 53, verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He has brought his lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before shears is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. And then 1 Peter 2, 23, he's quoting Old Testament scripture here, who when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. So again, just fulfillment of scriptures here when Jesus didn't have much to say. You'll notice here, Mark does not record it, but you remember multiple times Pilate said, "I find no fault in this man." And in Matthew and Luke and John's gospel, you see that he said that multiple times, that he found no fault in this man. But for whatever reason, Mark here doesn't specifically record that. So Pilate here, he thought he would try something else. Verses 6 through 11. He thought, well, so I won't have to make this difficult decision because I don't find any fault in this man. I don't find any reason to put him to death, to crucify him like y'all say needs to be done. He says, I'll give the people a choice, and I'll let them decide that they can release Jesus, because that was just the yearly rules that they had there at the feast, that they let somebody go. They let a known criminal go. So he said, I'll give them that choice, and maybe they'll choose to let Jesus go, and then I won't have to make this decision to actually have him crucified. Of course, we see that didn't work, because in verse number 11, apparently the chief priest had already got to the crowd and told them what to do. It says, but the chief priest moved the people that they should rather release unto them Barabbas. And remember, Barabbas, of course, he was a murderer here. Verse number 7 says, and there was one named Barabbas who lay bound with them that had made insurrection or riot. There's a big riot went on at some particular point in time with him who had committed murder in this insurrection. So whenever this riot took place, we don't know when it was, it got so bad Barabbas had actually killed somebody. So they said, no, we want you to release a murderer. Instead of the sinless Son of God, we want you to release this murderer as part of this custom. So, of course, we know that's what ultimately happened. And then we go on to verses 12 through 14, and we see, of course, Jesus' own people here. We know the Jews. They're the ones that brought all these accusations up against Jesus. 2 different times in verses 13 and also in verse number 14. Notice what they say. He says, verse 13, and they cried out again, crucify him. And then Peter and Pilate again, verse 14. Why? He asks again, why? What has he done? What evil has he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, last part of verse number 14, crucify him. So they were adamant. These Jews were adamant that they wanted Jesus crucified, and they wanted to do away with him. They wanted to get rid of him. So we see that Pilate here offering to release Jesus, that didn't work. So he was still going to have to make a decision. So verse number 15 says, and so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them. Again, he did what they wanted. He let the murderer go and delivered Jesus, when he had scourged him, to be crucified. Now, we don't know here, but Pilate, just think about it. This is just, peritheology, I guess. What if Pilate thought, well, maybe since that didn't work, saying we'll let Jesus be released, so I won't have to crucify this innocent man. He says, what if after I scourge him, or have him scourged, and that these people see how agonizingly painful that scourging would be, once they see the after effects, then maybe they'll change their mind, and maybe they won't want him crucified. Of course, we know that again, that's just hypothetical for me. I'm just thinking here. What if maybe he thought that? Either way, of course, we know it didn't work, because the next few verses we see here that Jesus, of course, was still crucified. Now, again, he says here in the last part of verse number 15 that he had him scourged. And then after that, of course, they were going to take him to the crucifixion and to be crucified. And I know we've all heard what a scourging is, but let me just remind you a few things that happened during a scourging. And again, that was typical procedure. If a person was condemned to be crucified, they typically would scourge them first, or beat them. It's just talking about a brutal beating, is what it's talking about. So let me just read you a little bit here. It says, a scourging was a legal preliminary to every Roman execution, and only women and Roman senators or soldiers were exempt. The usual instrument was a short whip with several single or braided leather thongs of variable lengths, in which small iron balls or sharp pieces of sheep bones were tied onto it at different intervals. So it's like a whip. You've all seen a whip. But this wasn't just a leather whip. It had pieces of bone and iron balls, different things, tied onto that whip. And it says occasionally sticks were used too. They would tie sticks to it. It says, for scourging, the man was stripped of his clothing, and his hands were tied to an upright post. The back, the buttocks, and the legs were flogged either by two soldiers or by one who alternated positions. And it says the severity of the scourging depended on the disposition of the soldier. What position the soldier may have been in when he was actually slinging the whip. And it was intended to weaken the victim to a state just short of collapse or death. And after the scourging, the soldiers often taunted their victim. So sometimes, history tells us that sometimes these people didn't even survive the scourging. It was so brutal that they would actually die right there, and they couldn't even take them to the cross. A little bit more, as the Roman soldiers repeatedly struck the victim's back with full force, the iron balls would cause deep contusions, and the leather thongs and sheep bones would cut into the skin, and also even to the underside of the skin. It says, then as the scourging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. The pain and the blood loss generally set the stage for circulatory shock, and the extent of the blood loss may have well determined how long the victim would survive on the cross. And so that's, just a little bit historically about what a scourging is. And this is what Jesus, he went through. I mean, this was a scourging, and the cross is yet to come. So remember, we already talked about, they had already hit Jesus with their fists. They'd already slapped him with the palms of their hands, and they'd already spit on him. We talked about that last week. That's happened to probably everybody. You know how awful that is. But these are things, this is what Jesus went through. I mean, he had done nothing wrong. We know that by the scriptures. He was sinless. But even Pilate, the Roman governor, even Pilate said, I don't find any fault with this man. But yet still, this is part of what Jesus went through for us, for you, and for me. And for even the ones that were doing it, for the Roman soldiers that actually had the whip and was actually doing the beating, Jesus died for that person too. I mean, what kind of love is that? It's just we can't comprehend that kind of love. So Pilate here had him scourged, and we see what happens in verses 16 through 18. Let me reread those verses. And the soldiers, of course, after he had been scourged, the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole band, and they clothed him with purple and plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews. So they took him back here to Praetorium, the hall, Praetorium. And here they were just mocking Jesus, is what they were doing here. And of course we know the purple robe they put on him, supposed to signify royalty, right? He said he claimed to be the King of the Jews. So again, this was just all mockery, because we know they didn't believe any of that. So they put a purple robe signifying royalty, and they mocked him, saying here in verse 18, Hail, King of the Jews. And that was just all mockery. And they also made a crown of thorns. Again, signifying a king. King wore a crown, right? They made this crown of thorns and put it on his head here as well. Now these thorns, it's not thorns like you'd think of today. I know a lot of times, if you get, you know how it is, if you just get pricked with a thorn off of just a simple rose bush. You know how that hurts? I mean, it hurts, doesn't it? And I was back last fall, I was clearing off a little bit of the land there at the house, and there's some kind of trees. I don't know what they're called, but they got some. Pam, what do you remember what they were called?
You might call them lotus trees.
But they got thorns on them as long as your little finger, and they're like little spikes. And of course, I got spiked with those several times when I was doing some of that cleaning, and just getting pricked with things like that. You know how that hurts. Everybody's been pricked with a thorn, just minor. Well, that's not this kind of thorn I'm talking about on this tree. Might have been similar to what they used here, but a little rosebush thorn. It's nothing like what they made this crown of thorns out of, and they put it on his head. Let me just read you a little bit about what that crown of thorns may have looked like. It says, in the case of Jesus, he claimed to be king. Thus, the Roman soldiers choose to mock the kingship of Jesus. And in order to do this, the soldiers took part of a thorn bush and formed a cap that covered his entire head. These thorns probably came from the Syrian Christ thorn plant. And these thorns, they were as hard as nails. Again, not like a little thorn you see in a rose bush or something. And when these soldiers rammed down the crown of thorns on the head of Jesus, the thorns went to the two major nerves that covered the entire head. And when the crown of thorns came down upon Jesus, he experienced shooting pains throughout his whole facial area. And there would be agonizing pain all over the front and the sides of his face. There would also be agonizing pain on the insides of his ears. It would have been the equivalent of having someone come up with a knife and stabbing a person all over the face. And that's what this crown of thorns were. Don't let these pictures you see, don't let those pictures fool you. I mean, these were, they don't tell how long they were. They may have been 2 or 3 inches long. And when they pressed that down on his head, I read you the kind of pain that would have caused. And again, like a knife. Can you imagine somebody just taking a knife and just stabbing you in the head with it? Can you imagine that kind of pain? Well, again, these are some things that Jesus went through for us. He's been through the beating. He's been through the scourging. And Isaiah says that he wasn't even recognizable. You wouldn't even known that he was a human, much less who he was. And then now this crown of thorns, these spikes, if you will, going down here on his head. So, all these things Jesus did here for us. So they put this crown of thorns here. They put it on his head. But notice verse number 19, what else they did. And they smote him on the head with a reed or a stick or a club. And they did spit upon him and bowed their knees, worshiping him. So it's been bad enough when these guys pushed the crown of thorns down on Jesus' head, but then they got a rod or a stick or a club, and they're just beating him on the head with that, just driving those thorns just deeper into his head. And I just can't comprehend this myself. I mean, we've heard about this all our life. We've read about it all our life and studied about it, but it's just so hard to comprehend that somebody that had done nothing wrong would go through something like this for me, for you, and for even these Roman soldiers here that were even doing this. That they even made the crown of thorns and were beating the thorns deeper into his head. And then we'll go on, verse number 20. See what else they did. Again, remember, these soldiers here, they were just mocking Jesus. They didn't believe he was who he said he was, and it was just all mockery. But verse 20, and when they had mocked him, they took off the purple from him and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Now, again, remember, they had already beaten Jesus, and we talked about, he probably had exposed muscle after being beaten as he had. So can you imagine? They put that robe on him. It says a robe, so I'm assuming that's literally what it was. Probably something heavy they put on him with all that his flesh just ripped off, all that exposed muscle, probably exposed bone. And they put that robe on him and were beating him and stuff. But then they took it off. We don't know how long it was on there, but you know how it is sometimes. If you've been bleeding and you put a bandage on, and you take that bandage off, you know how that hurts sometimes, and it just pulls the flesh and stuff away. Well, they put this robe on him. And when they pulled it off of him, it probably did the same all over his body. You can't even imagine. I mean, when they took this robe back off of him, it was probably had stuck, maybe. And they pulled it off, and just the agonizing pain. More pain here that it caused Jesus. And then, after they did that, then they put his own clothes back on him. And that just had to hurt too, even more. They took the robe off. And then they put his clothes back on, just excruciating pain. We have no idea. I mean, we read about it, we try to explain it, we try to talk about it, but we really can't. It's really unexplainable. So it says here, after all that, after the scourging, after the mocking, after the crown of thorns, and then taking the robe off and putting his clothes back on him, says then they led him away to be crucified, the last part of verse number 20. So here we see again, remember we're talking about in Pilate's hall, how Jesus is condemned here to die. So he is condemned to die. And they take him to crucify him. And that's what we'll see in our next section, beginning in chapter 15 here, verse 21, through the rest of the book, through chapter 15, and then also through chapter 16. We're going to still see Jesus. We're going to see, remember, he's a servant. Mark presents him as the servant, and we're going to see where he finishes his work here on the earth that his Father had sent him to do. And it's broken down into 4 different sections. We're going to see the servant's death. We're going to see the servant's burial, the servant's resurrection, and then of course the servant's ascension in the last part of Mark chapter number 16. So again, they've done all these awful things to Jesus, which was bad enough, but now it's time for the crucifixion. So let me pick up here, Mark 15. I'll pick up reading verse 21, read through verse 41. And we'll see here now the servant's death, or the actual crucifixion. Mark 15, verse 21. And they compel one Simon a Cyrenian, who passed by coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. And they bring him into the place Golgotha, which is being interpreted the place of the skull. They gave him to drink wine mingled with myrrh, but he received it not. And when they had crucified him, they parted his garments, casting lots upon them, what every man should take. And it was the third hour, and they crucified him. And a superscription of his accusation was written over the king of the Jews. And with him they crucified two thieves, the one on the right hand, the other on the left. And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And they that passed by railed on him, wagging their heads, and saying, thou that destroyest the temple, and buildest it in 3 days, save thyself, and come down from the cross. Likewise also the chief priests, mocking, said among themselves, with the scribes, he saved others, himself he cannot save. Let Christ the King of Israel descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe. And they that were crucified with him reviled him. And when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of them that stood by, when they heard it, said, Behold, he calleth Elias. And one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink, saying, Let alone, let us see whether Elias will come to take him down. And Jesus cried with a loud voice, and gave up the ghost. And the veil of the temple was rent in twain, from the top to the bottom. And when the centurion, which stood over against him, saw that he so cried out and gave up the ghost, he said, Truly this man was the Son of God. There were also women looking on afar off, among whom was Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the Less, and of Joses, and Salome, who also, when he was in Galilee, followed him and ministered unto him, and many other women which came up with him unto Jerusalem. So here we see the servant's death. Jesus actually dying here on the cross. So the first section here we're going to see is the servant's death. But this part is also broken up into 3 different periods of time, as we just read. We've got the 3rd hour, we've got the 6th hour, and you've got the 9th hour. Verse 25, 33, and 34. Now, if we use the Jewish time system, back then, the 3rd hour would have been 9 a.m., the 6th hour would have been noon, and in the 9th hour would have been 3 p.m., again using the Jewish time system back in Jesus' day. So let's look first at what happened during the 3rd hour. Again, back to verse number 21. And they compelled one Simon, a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander Rufus, to bear his cross. Now, remember, according to the law, a guilty person had to carry his own cross, or at least the cross beam, which, of course, is the T part that went across. He would at least have to carry that on his shoulder. But remember, we just got through talking about the brutal beating that Jesus had went through. So he may not have been able physically to carry it himself. So they got this Simon here of Cyrene to help. And this just shows, again, more of the humanity side of Jesus. We know Jesus was God, 100. He was God, but he was also man. And so, he felt all this pain and this agony when they beat him. And so he might have been just weak, real weak. And so the Roman soldiers there, they've got this man Simon to help bear his cross. There in verse 21. And see where they take it, verse 22. And they bring him into the place Golgotha, which being interpreted is the place of the skull. And that's what the word Golgotha means. It means skull. That's what it means. Now, today, if you would go over there to the Holy Land, what they commonly refer to today as Gordon's Calvary, it does appear to have the appearance of a skull. If you looked at it from a distance, it looks like a skull. And that's where they think maybe that the crucifixion actually took place. Now, we don't know. Nobody knows 100% sure if that was the place. But again, it's called Golgotha, the place of the skull. And really, exactly where it took place, that's not important. Just the fact that we know it did take place, and Jesus was crucified on Golgotha, which means skull. So again, we're just getting in to the crucifixion. So we'll stop here. Lord willing, we'll take up verse 23 next week and continue to look at this awful death. It was one of the worst types of execution there's ever been, is a crucifixion. And we're going to look at that more next week, maybe in a little more in depth too, and see exactly what Jesus went through for you and for me and for the sins of the whole world. So again, Mark 15 verse 23 next week.